I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
King Charles entered the private vault expecting another routine review of possessions left behind by his mother. Instead, one sealed financial instruction changed the atmosphere inside the room instantly. Queen Elizabeth had made a deeply personal decision before her death. A protected reserve of private funds was designated for William. Charles read the relevant line twice. Then his hands lowered, his composure broke, and the king was suddenly fighting tears. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles looked at the page, as though reading it might somehow change the meaning. The private vault was not part of the crown estate, the assets held for the monarch's official role. This record concerned Elizabeth's privately controlled wealth. That distinction mattered because it did not alter the line of succession. It revealed something more personal. She had deliberately set aside a reserve for her grandson. William remained silent beside him. The Prince of Wales, the title held by the heir to the British throne, felt no triumph. He had grown up under his grandmother's steady instruction, learning that privilege was tied to duty, and now the money felt less like an inheritance than a message. Charles noticed his son's discomfort, but the monarch was wrestling with something deeper. Why had Elizabeth never told him? One custodian placed a second page beside the first. Charles saw his mother's handwritten confirmation and removed his glasses. He wiped his eyes and read the additional clause. The funds had not been left to William for comfort or status. They had been preserved for a future responsibility Elizabeth believed he would one day carry. A burden she expected would demand independence, discipline, and protection for his family. William leaned closer when he noticed the date. The instruction had been finalized during a tense period inside the royal household, not during routine planning. That detail changed the mood. He asked what had happened then, and Charles stiffened. The king remembered arguments, difficult conversations, and one family gathering that had ended in a silence nobody wanted to explain. Charles closed the folder and placed both palms flat against the table. He said William's name quietly, then stopped. For several seconds, neither spoke. The inheritance was no longer about money. It was about what Elizabeth feared, what she prepared for, and why she protected William without explaining it to Charles. But Charles's tears were not really about money. They came from realizing that his mother had made a judgment about the future, and William now had to discover exactly what she believed he would one day need to survive. For William, the vault discovery created no sense of victory. For Charles, it created something far more complicated than jealousy. Elizabeth had loved both men, but she had understood them in profoundly different ways. Now one private decision seemed to place those differences on paper forever. In a quiet room away from advisors, father and son were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Inheritance can reveal what families spend years avoiding aloud. Charles stared at the financial page without touching it. As Elizabeth's eldest son, he had spent most of his life preparing to inherit the sovereign's public burden, the duty of serving as head of the monarchy rather than owning it personally. That distinction made the private decision hurt more. The money did not threaten his crown. It touched something deeper. Whether his mother trusted his reign while quietly preparing for what might come after it. William understood that pain. His bond with Elizabeth had been built around discipline, continuity, and the future he could never escape. The Prince of Wales, the title traditionally held by the monarch's direct heir, had learned from his grandmother that privilege meant responsibility before comfort. He looked at his father and saw no rival. He saw a son wounded by a mother who had left behind an answer without explaining the question. Charles finally spoke. "Why didn't she tell me?" The king did not ask about the amount, the conditions, or control. He asked about silence. William answered carefully, saying he had never requested the arrangement, and would not let Elizabeth's choice become a competition between them. Then he slid the page back across the table. Her intention, he said, mattered more than who physically held the paper. The wording supported him. Elizabeth had ring-fenced the funds, meaning she had protected them for defined purposes rather than ordinary spending. The reserve was tied to family continuity, private obligations, and pressures she believed could emerge during a future transition. Charles read that section again, and his expression changed. This was not luxury. It was preparation. Then William noticed another name. A notation beside the instruction referred to Princess Anne, Charles's sister, as someone aware of Elizabeth's concerns before the arrangement was finalized. The king went still. Anne had known something. More importantly, she might know why their mother had acted without telling him. William suggested they speak to her. Charles hesitated. An old Windsor confrontation was already returning to him, along with a silence he had never understood. And once Anne's name entered the conversation, the vault discovery stopped being a mystery about money and became a doorway into one particular night the family had tried hard to forget. The decision inside Elizabeth's vault did not begin with accountants, trustees, or financial planning. It began with an argument. Years earlier, during a family gathering at Windsor, a conversation about the monarchy's future became unexpectedly personal. Charles defended his vision. William challenged one part of it. Elizabeth listened longer than anyone realized. And when the room finally emptied, the late Queen made a remark to Anne that would eventually explain everything found inside that vault. Charles had spent years preparing for the responsibilities he believed would pass from one reign to the next. Windsor, one of the monarch's principal royal residences, had hosted private family discussions, but this one carried weight. Elizabeth was thinking beyond her son's future reign. She had begun watching William less as a grandson to protect, and more as a future sovereign who might one day carry both public duty and private family pressure at the same time. William chose his words carefully, but the tension still rose. The prince argued that future private resources should not be controlled so tightly that the next generation entered its responsibilities without room to act. Charles heard something different. To him, his son was stepping into questions that belonged to a reign that had not even begun. Elizabeth watched both men, then interrupted. The Queen said the family had to prepare for the reign after the reign. Charles fell silent, because he understood what she meant. William left the discussion frustrated, convinced his father had misunderstood him. Charles remained unsettled, feeling that his mother had publicly widened the distance between them. Elizabeth did not follow either man. Instead, she stayed seated, tapped one finger against the table, and asked Princess Anne to close the door. Anne, her daughter and one of her most trusted family confidants, sensed that the conversation was not finished. Elizabeth then gave the instruction that changed everything. In a documented private account preserved within the fictional family record, Anne later recalled that her mother asked for a confidential review of personal reserves that could eventually be secured for William. The Queen feared that future constitutional obligations, meaning the formal public duties attached to kingship, could leave him carrying responsibility while still needing independent means to protect his household and preserve continuity. Anne remembered one sentence Charles had never heard. Elizabeth had explained why the reserve was not meant for her son. Charles would inherit the institution first, but William might inherit the consequences of everything that came after. Charles had spent years remembering that night as a disagreement. Anne was about to reveal that Elizabeth remembered it as a warning, and her explanation would strike directly at the king's deepest insecurity. Charles did not summon a committee. He went to his sister. The meeting was private, short on ceremony, and heavy with everything none of them had said since Elizabeth died. Anne knew immediately why he had come. Charles placed the copied vault instruction before her and asked the question he could no longer contain. Why had their mother protected William in a way she had never explained to her own son? Anne did not rush to comfort him. Princess Anne, the monarch's sister and a senior working member of the royal family, had always occupied a difficult place between loyalty and truth. She had defended Charles when others judged him too quickly, yet she had also remained fiercely loyal to Elizabeth's wishes. That mattered now because lawyers could explain clauses and signatures, but only Anne had been present when their mother decided what those words were supposed to mean. Charles leaned forward and finally asked the question beneath every other question. Did she think I would fail him? The king's voice carried more pain than anger. Anne answered without hesitation. Elizabeth had not been casting a vote against her son's kingship. She had been preparing for the burden William might inherit after Charles had already carried his own. The distinction should have comforted him. Instead, it cut deeper. Anne explained what Elizabeth had feared. Charles would spend his reign protecting the institution, preserving stability, defending tradition, and keeping the machinery of monarchy moving through pressure. William might one day face something different, the need to protect his immediate family, while carrying the consequences of decisions made across several generations. The king pushed his chair backward and walked several steps away. He had heard the words clearly. He simply did not want to accept what they implied. Anne then repeated the sentence preserved in her documented private account of that old Windsor conversation. Elizabeth had said William could one day inherit a crown already carrying the cost of several generations. The Queen had therefore viewed the reserve as a shield, not a reward. Charles returned to the table and asked his sister to repeat the words exactly. She did. This time he did not interrupt. Anne added one final truth. Elizabeth had deliberately ordered the instructions sealed, because she feared early disclosure would create resentment between father and son before either man was ready to understand it. Charles finally saw the logic, but the answer created another problem. The funds were protected by a private governing mechanism, meaning the legal structure controlling when and how the reserve could be used. The emotional mystery had finally been answered, but the practical battle was only beginning, because Elizabeth had entrusted her wishes to a structure designed to resist even the pressure of a reigning king. Elizabeth had not merely written William's name beside a sum of money. She had built safeguards around the decision. That discovery changed everything. Charles could question the choice, William could refuse to exploit it, and courtiers could debate its meaning. But the mechanism itself had been deliberately constructed to survive emotion. For the first time since the vault opened, everyone realized Elizabeth had expected resistance, and had prepared for it long before her final days. Charles studied the arrangement differently now. The private structure placed control with designated custodians, trusted individuals required to follow written conditions rather than personal wishes. That mattered, because neither the king nor William could simply redirect the reserve whenever emotions changed. The money had been protected for family stability, private obligations, and preparations connected to the prince's future responsibilities. It was inheritance with boundaries, not freedom without consequence. William reacted with unease instead of relief. He told his father he would rather surrender the entire arrangement than allow it to become a permanent division between them. Charles answered more sharply than expected. Rejecting Elizabeth's intention, the monarch said, could dishonor her just as surely as abusing it. For the first time, he was no longer asking why his mother had chosen his son. He was asking what burden she had expected him to help William carry. Then one handwritten instruction changed the temperature again. Elizabeth had written that the reserve should provide independence when duty and family cannot be separated. William read the phrase twice. The future king understood the warning immediately. There could come a moment when protecting those closest to him and serving the institution became impossible to treat as separate responsibilities. Charles watched his son absorb that meaning, and something in his resistance finally gave way. Charles reached for an unsigned challenge memorandum that had been prepared in case he wanted the arrangement reviewed. A memorandum was simply a formal written note, setting out a proposed decision or course of action. The king held it for several seconds, then tore it once down the middle. He told the custodians he would not challenge, restructure, or interfere with Elizabeth's instructions. They were to execute her wishes exactly as written. William did not smile. He understood that his father's acceptance removed the last emotional shield between him and the inheritance. Charles had stopped fighting it, which meant the responsibility was now real. News of that choice began moving through the wider household, deeply surprising those who had expected resistance entirely. By refusing to fight his mother's decision, Charles ended one battle, but his acceptance made the inheritance real, and that reality was about to change William's position inside the family overnight. The moment Charles stepped away from resistance, William lost the one excuse that had allowed him to treat the inheritance as someone else's problem. Elizabeth's decision was now his to carry, not as a prize, not as proof that he had been favored, but as an obligation deliberately placed in his hands. The prince retreated from the wider family discussion, read the complete instruction alone, and discovered just how personally his grandmother had written about his future. William knew the practical uncertainty had ended. Senior household figures had been informed that Charles would honor the private arrangement without challenge, removing the possibility of an internal struggle over control. The principal reserve, meaning the protected core amount intended to remain intact, now carried conditions that William himself would have to respect. That mattered, because accepting the money also meant accepting the purpose Elizabeth had attached to it. William reached the final page and stopped. The Queen had written about family security, continuity, and the need to preserve independence during periods of extreme responsibility. He lowered the document and pressed one hand against his forehead. For years, his grandmother had prepared him for duty in careful conversations and quiet corrections. Now he understood that she had also been preparing resources for pressures she believed he might face long after she was gone. Catherine listened when William finally spoke about what troubled him. The Princess of Wales, the wife of the heir and his closest family partner, understood immediately that the inheritance was not simply his burden. He told her the money itself meant almost nothing compared with the realization behind it. Elizabeth had been thinking about them years ahead. Catherine answered softly that perhaps this was exactly why the Queen had protected the reserve before circumstances could force difficult choices upon them. William read another passage and found the meaning widened again. Elizabeth had not written only about her grandson. Her instructions pointed toward future generations, making family stability part of the reserve's moral purpose. The prince understood that the protection extended beyond him, toward the children and the responsibilities they might eventually inherit. "She was preparing us before we knew we needed preparing," he told Catherine, then closed the handwritten page. William made his decision soon afterward. He would not absorb the principal reserve into ordinary personal spending. He would preserve it under Elizabeth's conditions, turning what could have looked like privilege into something closer to a responsibility carried between generations. Catherine supported him, knowing restraint would speak louder than possession. Charles heard about his son's choice. The king asked William to meet him privately. No advisors, no Anne, and no documents between them. Elizabeth's money had revealed her plan, but the next meeting would reveal something far more important: whether a father and son could finally stop interpreting her decision as a judgment between them. There were no secretaries in the room, no financial papers, no royal advisors waiting outside with talking points. Just Charles and William, father and son, sitting opposite each other after days of tension, created by the wishes of a woman they both loved. For the first time since the vault opened, neither man discussed numbers. Charles spoke instead about Elizabeth as his mother, and admitted why discovering her secret provision for William had hurt so deeply. Charles had spent a lifetime beneath Elizabeth's reign, measuring his own future against a duty that seemed endlessly distant. Now the practical dispute was settled, and the private mechanism governing the reserve, the rules controlling how the money could be held and used, no longer needed debate. That left only grief. The king had lost his mother after decades of waiting to carry her burden. William had lost the grandmother who had quietly prepared him for responsibilities he could never avoid. Charles finally said what he had resisted saying aloud. For one painful moment, he had believed the inheritance meant Elizabeth trusted William more than him. The confession changed the room immediately. The monarch was no longer defending a position. He was admitting a wound. William listened without interruption, then answered as a son rather than an heir. His grandmother's decision, he said, only made sense if she believed Charles would first carry the crown successfully. William leaned forward and made the logic clear. His future burden existed because his father's reign came before his own. Elizabeth had not skipped a generation in trust. She had prepared 2 generations for different stages of the same duty for the future. Charles absorbed that slowly. Then the king admitted that perhaps his mother had not divided them at all. Perhaps she had simply placed responsibility across time. Charles felt tears return, but they carried no humiliation now. He reached across the table, briefly gripped William's hand, and said Elizabeth would never have wanted money to stand between them. The prince promised that the reserve would never become a weapon in family politics. He would preserve its purpose, protect its conditions, and refuse to let anyone use it as proof that one man had defeated the other. That promise changed what came next. Charles and William agreed that when the story reached the public, they would not feed the image of a fractured family. They would appear together, united by the same decision that had nearly driven them apart. That private handshake settled the family conflict, but outside palace walls, the story was exploding into something much larger, and the public was about to decide what Elizabeth's final choice appeared to say about the monarchy's future. By morning, the private discovery had become a national conversation. The question was no longer simply why Elizabeth left protected funds to William. It was what the decision symbolized. Some saw an extraordinary act of foresight. Others saw a grandmother preparing the future king for burdens no one else could carry for him. But one image captured the public mood more powerfully than any debate. Charles and William appearing together after days of speculation. Charles knew the distinction mattered. Elizabeth's private wealth was separate from crown property, the assets connected to the monarchy's official role rather than the sovereign's personal possessions. That difference stopped the inheritance from becoming a constitutional crisis, but it made the emotional meaning even stronger. The palace kept the financial details private, while confirming within the dramatized account that her wishes would be respected, and that no dispute remained between father and son. Charles also faced a harsher interpretation. Broadcasters discussed his emotional reaction inside the vault, and some commentary framed those tears as humiliation. The king understood why the story looked dramatic, but those closest to the moment knew something different. He had not broken because William had received money. He had broken because his mother had planned for a future beyond his reign, without ever explaining that decision to him. William refused to answer speculation with triumph. The prince gave no celebratory statement and made no attempt to present himself as Elizabeth's preferred successor. That restraint mattered, because succession, the legal order deciding who inherits the throne, had never been changed by the private arrangement. His father remained sovereign. William remained heir. The difference was that the public could now see how carefully the late queen had thought beyond both men. Then one fictional morning edition outside Windsor captured the frenzy in 4 words: Elizabeth's final gift to William. Crowds gathered near the castle gates, while broadcasters repeated the same footage of Charles and his son arriving for an engagement. The reaction shifted when the king paused long enough for William to reach his side. Neither man spoke. They simply continued together. William understood the gesture immediately. Charles had chosen continuity over competition, and the future king answered by matching his father's pace rather than moving ahead. That simple moment weakened days of speculation more effectively than any formal statement could have done. Yet one decision remained unfinished. The public had already decided that Elizabeth's final gift was about the future, but Charles still had one last chance to decide what it would mean inside the family. And he chose a gesture no document could have required. The story began with a vault, a sealed instruction, and a king struggling to hold back tears. It could have ended as a tale of favoritism, a dead queen choosing her grandson over her son. Instead, the final truth was more powerful. Elizabeth had not used her wealth to rank the men she loved. She had used it to prepare them for different chapters of the same responsibility. Charles finally understood that distinction, and William accepted its weight. Charles returned to the vault record. The private financial instruction, a personal document directing how Elizabeth's assets should be handled, remained as she had written it. William would receive responsibility for the protected reserve under her conditions, while the king refused to interfere. That mattered, because the arrangement changed no constitutional order. Charles remained sovereign, and his son remained the heir whose future would come after his father's reign. Charles read the handwritten page slowly. This time, the monarch did not look wounded. He touched the edge of the paper, paused, and allowed a smile through the emotion. Elizabeth's decision no longer felt like rejection. It felt like preparation. She had trusted her son with the monarchy of the present, while preparing her grandson for responsibilities that might arrive. William accepted that meaning without celebration. The prince told his father he would treat the money as something borrowed from one generation for the protection of another. He would preserve the reserve, respect its conditions, and never turn it into proof that Elizabeth had favored him. Charles looked at his son and answered that this restraint was why his mother believed William could carry the responsibility. Charles then signed a formal acknowledgement, a written confirmation that Elizabeth's private wishes would be executed without alteration. The king placed his signature beneath the wording, set the page beside his mother's instruction, and closed the folder. Then he handed it to William. The gesture was not surrender, it was trust. William took the folder knowing there was no victory inside it. Charles had not been defeated, and Elizabeth had not chosen between them. One man had been entrusted with the crown now, the other had been prepared for the burden waiting beyond it. What emerged from that royal vault was never truly about who received the money. It was about what Elizabeth believed would endure after her. A son strong enough to accept her decision, a grandson prepared to carry its responsibility, and a monarchy surviving because one generation finally understood what the previous generation had been trying to protect. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.